Good morning, good afternoon, colleagues, for those who are not on the East Coast. Good morning again. My name is Robert Jenkins, and I'm a CID faculty affiliate and the faculty of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. I'm thrilled to be here and really pleased to have be part of this discussion with our amazing panelists. And thank you very much to all of you for taking time out of, I know it's an incredibly busy schedule right now for everyone, for making time for this important discussion. Let me just quickly introduce the Harvard Center for International Development, and then I'll quickly begin the discussion. The Harvard Center for International Development is a research center that works across the university and with a global network of researchers and practitioners. CID convenes academic and practitioner networks and deploys breakthrough research that addresses the world's most pressing questions. At CID, we believe that together we can develop and implement policies that help everyone reach their full potential. The new CID Spotlight Series on the future of U.S. foreign aid seeks to provide insights into the current and future roles of foreign aid agencies through conversation with leaders. You'll soon hear from our panelists today on. They'll be sharing their firsthand experience in directing aid initiatives and how that shapes policy and overall addressing development challenges. We're going to move the last two conversations in this focus. We'll focus on the link between foreign aid and foreign policy and foreign aid effectiveness. But the discussion today aims to throw light on the humanitarian aspect of the larger foreign aid and USAID conversation. We all recognize, I'm sure, that we're having this conversation at a moment of extraordinary uncertainty in the global aid broader ecosystem. We also, I'm sure, all recognize the needs have never been greater, but also the uncertainty has never been greater. So we have these sort of two dynamics that are in play. The United States has long been the world's largest humanitarian donor, accounting for about 43% of total aid in 2024, with USAID playing an absolute pivotal role in how globally we can effectively respond to crisis. And today we all recognize, I'm sure, as we read in the news and follow this closely, that role is facing great uncertainty, and that's the root of this conversation. The potential impact is indeed global and having a knock-on effect with others, either a knock-on effect or it's also the changing global context. Just as, again, a couple of glimpses into that, the United Kingdom has redirected certain percentage of their aid budget to increasing military expenditures. Switzerland and Sweden are looking at scaling back their assistance. Germany may also. So a lot of worrying trends and indeed lots of uncertainty. There are other major donors such as Japan and France, but also rising donors, India, China, and the Gulf states that are showing signs of potentially more stability, but not sort of replacing the decrease of other key actors. The recent USAID funding freeze and broader proposed cuts to U.S. foreign aid does raise a few urgent questions around the future of humanitarian assistance, which will be the heart of the discussion today. What happens when funding becomes more unpredictable? How do humanitarian agencies prioritize or react to those changes? And what are the kind of immediate but also underlying and more structural or longer term changes that we can foresee? Beyond the financial constraints, we're also seeing some, I would say, long-standing changes and demands and the political sort of structure around foreign aid, which that also influences this conversation. That includes a growing criticism and skepticism of the impact of the aid system itself. There's calls to localize humanitarian response. There's a shift very much in the power and resources and where decision-making takes place, that also very much frames this discussion. So today, we're not just discussing the state of the humanitarian response, but we're also going to be looking at some harder questions about the future. What does USAID funding freeze, potential funding freeze and changes in funding mean for people on the ground and implementation of those programs that are funded by USAID? And again, the broader context. What reforms are needed to make humanitarian aid more resilient, more equitable, more innovative, more impactful? And how do we ensure that the system doesn't just continue to respond to crises, but actually also has more longer term and resilience building and preventive impact? Let me now quickly introduce our speakers, and I'll be asking questions during this very exciting next 50 minutes. I'll begin with Abby Maxman. She's the president and CEO of Oxfam America, a champion of gender and climate justice with over 30 years of experience in international humanitarian relief and development policy. She has led responses to major crises around the world, including from post-genocide Rwanda to the Ebola epidemic. Jeremy Konyndyk, president of Refugees International and a seasoned humanitarian leader who's previously directed USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance, OFDA, under the Obama administration, and later oversaw USAID's global COVID-19 response under the Biden administration. And Dr. Matthew Kavanagh, director of Georgetown University's Center for Global Health Policy and Politics, whose work focuses on the intersection of global health, law, and policy. He's advised UNAIDS, the WHO, US policymakers, and others on pandemic preparedness, health equity, and humanitarian crises. Thank you all so much for being here. We really greatly appreciate it. So let me begin with the current situation, and we can just start with looking at the present moment, given what we know now and recognizing it's a very fast-moving space, but what do you each feel is the immediate impact of these potential changes or actual changes that are happening on humanitarian operations? And are aid programs already being scaled back? And what are the most urgent concerns you're hearing from your own networks and partners on the ground? Maybe, Abby, I'll begin with you, and then I can pass to Jeremy and Matthew. Abby, can I pass to you?
Thanks so much, Robert. Really good to be here in such an important conversation. Things are fast moving every single day. Just this morning, Secretary of State Rubio announced that 83% of USAID fund programs are cut, canceled 5,200 contracts, billions of funding no longer going to people experiencing conflict and natural disasters. And this means only 18% of USAID programs, maybe 1,000, though it's pretty chaotic out there, will continue. We don't know the criteria. We don't know what it means. And as you said already, it comes at a time of increasing inequality, instability, hunger, humanitarian challenges, a system that was already stretched. Now, for us, I'll just say a few things. For Oxfam America, we don't accept U.S. government funding, but because of the cuts and the scale and the mandate of how that 43% works, it is really undermining all of the global humanitarian and development architecture at the moment that have relied heavily on USAID to support health systems, nutrition programs, and prevent starvation. So there's the immediate life-saving, which is already being felt and has been felt almost since day one of the chaotic rollout of terminations, waivers, rescinding of terminations, and so forth. And just, I'd say that there's four main areas that we're very worried about how this is being rolled out. It's been inefficient and wasteful, in direct contrast to the moniker of efficiency and stopping waste. It's been reckless and it's been heartless. And I think we can say, but it's hard to document given how much is going on right now. But preventable deaths have now not, we are witnessing a period of terrible loss to people who are most marginalized and deserve this least. Organizations have had to scale back dramatically. The impact on local partners are not to be overstated. People who, life-saving activities from gender-based violence, shelter, water, sanitation, hygiene that never even qualified for waivers, even though they should have. And just an example I'll give is looking at some of our programs around clean water and safe drinking water and latrines for 400,000 South Sudanese refugees in Gambela, Ethiopia, that works with UN agencies, have already had downstream impact on our ability to provide those very basics of clean water for refugee populations. That kind of example has immediate implications and reverberating implications to all our staff, because people don't understand and don't know who's who and why things are stopping so suddenly. So there's risks to all the incredible heroic staff out there. I have examples from Iraq and Kurdistan to the Philippines, mine action work, and Syria. And I'll just close there. 15.4 million people food insecure at a time when this is an opportunity to provide stability to this particular context. And we know that this vital funding that's been pulled during this humanitarian crisis, just as ongoing violence continues to displace people. It is a really upending time undertaken in a cruel and chaotic way.
Thank you, Abby. Jeremy, as president of Refugees International, love to hear your perspective on this.
Yeah, thanks. Abby's covered a lot of it. I think the thing to acknowledge and recognize right at the very top, I think, is that this is motivated by a desire to end or nearly end U.S. foreign assistance, full stop. The people who are carrying this out, and I think Secretary Rubio is a kind of bystander to that. I don't think this is probably the policy he would want if he were actually running the State Department. But he is at the mercy of Elon. Not to excuse him, because he is signing off and he does need to grow some backbone here. But he is sort of reacting to what's being driven by Elon Musk and what's being driven by a guy under him at the State Department, a guy by the name of Pete Morocco. And I think it's important to understand Morocco's role, because he is really the architect of a lot of what's happening. And he is someone who generally does not think the U.S. government should be in the business of foreign aid. He's been convening roundtables with outside, limited numbers of outside groups, where he's been saying things like the U.S. government should not do philanthropy and that should be left to the private sector and faith-based groups. So that is the mentality that's driving this. There's just a fundamental difference of view from what we've had in any past administration about the proper role of foreign aid. And so the approach here really is to kill off as much foreign aid as possible before the courts or Congress have a chance to catch up, because the courts move slowly, Congress moves even more slowly. And when you ignore the law, which is what they are doing, you can move very fast. Having served in government a few times, the law slows you down. If I hadn't had to follow the law, aspects of my job would have been a lot easier. So that's what they're doing. They're just trying to burn it all down and salt the earth, so that nothing remains by the time the courts and Congress catch up. And if and when that happens, it wouldn't surprise me if Pete Morocco then becomes the fall guy and gets kicked out of the State Department, but the damage will be done by that point. The impact on the global system of that really cannot be overstated. The U.S. provides 41% of all global humanitarian funding in a given year, 29% of all official development assistance. Within the humanitarian system, it's not just that 40-ish% of all funding. It's also underpinning really critical systems. So things like the Famine Early Warning System network, which is completely offline now. That is something that USAID funds and used, whatever tense of that verb we should now be in. But it was also a global good that the whole world relied on. Other donors relied on that, countries relied on that, aid organizations relied on that. It's gone. A lot of the core systems of the UN agencies that underpin a lot of the work that groups like Oxfam and other aid agencies do, likewise was heavily supported by the US government. And so when that funding goes away, it's not just that all programs shrink by 40%. It's actually that a lot of the core infrastructure of the system is then greatly compromised. And so kind of there's an effect over and above just the proportional amount of funding that is potentially being lost. Our teams have been in since the freeze began. We've had teams go out to Kenya, Syria, and Bangladesh to see different aspects of this. And across the board, what they're seeing is massive cuts, huge human damage. In Syria, in the Atmet camp, 150,000 IDPs, they're losing access to water because the funding is cut off. Even where agencies have gotten waivers from the State Department saying that their programs should not be canceled, the money is still not moving. And again, I think it's important to understand that, like Pete Morocco does not want this to survive. He is not, he is really countermanding what the secretary has ordered. He is continuing to block payments, even for programs that have been waived, even for programs that are clearly life-saving, even where people are right now dying. He is continuing to block payments with, and Rubio's letting him. So this is what's going on, and it's a huge problem, obviously, in what we're talking about here, the human impact that this is going to have on refugees and IDPs and people living in crises all over the world. But it's also hugely risky and concerning for US democracy and US rule of law writ large. Because if a mid-level political appointee in a department can just unilaterally decide the US government is not going to pay its financial obligations, that countermands Congress, it countermands the law, and it undermines the full faith and credit of the US government. There's $2 billion that USAID owes right now to partners for work already completed prior to the Trump administration that they are not paying. So, it's an assault on USAID, it's an assault on humanitarianism, but it's also, I think a first salvo in a much deeper assault on the rule of law and the Constitution of the United States.
Thank you very much, Abby, Jeremy. Really appreciate setting the scene. Very worrying, of course. Can I turn to you now, Matthew, recognizing your expertise and your experience in the health sector, maybe putting on an HIV/AIDS, maternal health, and pandemic preparedness angle to this, and asking a similar question. What are you hearing from the ground? And if you could just run us through the potential or ongoing current and potential impact.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for convening here. So we are currently in a just massive crisis when it comes to the global health sector and when it comes to pandemic preparedness. The global AIDS response and these broader efforts to stop the pandemics of today are in just massive crisis. Literally millions of people living with HIV are suddenly in danger of losing access to antiretroviral therapy. And Jeremy's point is right. There are no waivers. There is no systematic effort to say this is what was working and this is what was not. On the ground, what we are seeing is that in the countries with the highest prevalence of HIV, clinics are shutting down left and right. People are scrambling to enroll in some other clinic somewhere that's funded by a national government. The systems are really being overwhelmed. It is chaos, right? And the result of that is absolutely already deaths and transmission, right, of HIV. HIV prevention programs that serve the highest risk highest risk people around the world, they are absolutely been shut down. As we look at countries around the world, Cote d'Ivoire, Haiti, Tanzania, more than 90% of the AIDS response is funded by external sources. And so this point that it's not just the rapid shutdown of US funding, but the global shutdown of aid funding that actually the European donors have kind of followed suit is hugely, hugely damaging because there's nothing there that's going to fill the gap. And so, it's not just the 90% countries, but it's also the 50% countries and the 60% countries like Jamaica and Ethiopia and Zambia and Uganda, and then in South Sudan, where you've got just no capacity to respond. The estimate from UNAIDS is that it's probably going to cost 6 million lives unless reversed. 8 million additional new HIV infections just in the next 4 or 5 years. And that assumes that kind of, the best case scenario happens and that we don't see an economic crisis that follows what's being done. Beyond HIV, it's really important to also point out that, when Donald Trump was sworn in on January 20th, as he was being inaugurated, in Dar es Salaam, the government was declaring an outbreak of Marburg virus, right? Highly contagious, hemorrhagic fever. And it's the kind of thing that the government of Tanzania has tried not to draw attention to in the past. The shutdown that has happened has absolutely undermined the US ability to actually engage in that in a meaningful way. We've got Ebola in Uganda. It's continuing to grow. Worryingly, just in the last few days, they've reported a second cluster in Uganda. A boy died after seeking care in multiple places. And so now we've got 5 districts in Uganda that are affected, up from 3 just a week ago. On Uganda, this is the situation where you've got 2 major actors that would normally be involved. One is the United States government. And of course, the US CDC and the USAID have been pulled off the table in many ways. The second major actor, of course, is the multilateral system. And so it's really important to note that it's not just about USAID, it's not just about US government intervention, but it's about the wealthiest country in the world withdrawing not only its funding, but also its political support for the multilateral disease response system. And in that setting, WHO is scrambling because they are facing massive budget cuts. The Africa CDC is scrambling. And so we're not seeing the kinds of responses we would expect. And so we are making the world far more dangerous when it comes to public health. You've got Mpox, you've got bird flu, all of these things are true. And yet at this moment, not only are medicines not flowing, but we've got thousands of frontline health workers that have now been laid off just as this is happening. So this point, I would just argue, is that we're looking kind of broadly at a world that is more dangerous because of this work. And as Jeremy was saying, it just kind of represents this massive and dangerous misunderstanding of how the world works, right? Viruses do not respect borders. So this idea that somehow we can do isolationism, it just doesn't work. We saw that during COVID, we saw that during HIV, we've seen that in every single time. And so the idea that you can kind of replace the global coordination of WHO with some sort of domestic effort, it's absurd. And it's not only absurd, but it's ideological, right? There's this kind of, we're going to sacrifice the security of people around the world, but also the health of people in the United States because of this ideology that, as Jeremy points out, is also really contrary to law, right? So I was actually in the courtroom last week when Judge Ali was ruling on a preliminary injunction, and he literally held up the Constitution in his hand and said, look, I have the Constitution here, and it says in Article 1 that Congress is actually the ones with the power of the purse. Do you know what Congress is doing as we speak right now? Congress is appropriating money for these programs. The current stopgap spending measure that's being debated in the United States, Congress at this point has funding for these programs. And so we are not only in a global health crisis, but we are also sitting in the way in which a global health crisis and a humanitarian crisis is also triggering a constitutional crisis.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I think Abby, Jeremy, Matthew, you've really very clearly and alarmingly, actually, the immediate impact, but also the underlying structural impacts, not only of the impact of reducing aid and humanitarian funding specifically, but how it's being done and the knock-on effects. I think we're potentially going to run the risk of sort of singing to the choir to everyone that's on the call here. So I wonder if we pivot now to, I think we have 2 dimensions to now discuss, if I can request your opinions on. One is financing, so money into agencies and those who are working in the humanitarian space. And then we'll also discuss, as funding gets out, are there impacts on how it's spent and on what? But let's begin on the financing side. So we have this very significant reduction in USAID humanitarian, may or may not come back immediately, but I think many of us would predict it's unlikely to bounce back to previous levels in the short term, I think would be a fit. And then we have knock-on effects to others. So we have a reduction of governmental assistance. So I guess my question, maybe I'll start with you, Abby, and anyone else who can jump in afterwards, is are there other ways of financing that should be explored? Private sector, foundations, or other more innovative ways? Can we talk a little bit about are there any alternatives to financing all this important work?
Yeah, well, thanks, Robert. In the sector and in the space, we've been talking about that for some time. The recognition of dependency on too few actors has always been a risk. And indeed, it has to be yes, yes, yes. It has to be everybody, public, private, philanthropy, et cetera, stepping up. But we also know, so the diversification has always been something we've strived for, and not simply larger amounts of money. And as you said, the backfill, it's not even feasible or realistic. The system had been overstretched for a long time. The needs outstripping capacity, and as Jeremy was saying as an example about FuseNet, that was an early warning system looking outward and the immediate implications, but we know anticipatory action and investing now to prevent crises later has always been a good practice, best practice, and supporting local organizations. There's the tricky situation right now. It's about, the what is happening and the how it has been carried out. The cruelty, the lack of even any attempt at responsible sunsetting or transitioning seems designed, as was already said, to create, upheaval and chaos. But we do need to be looking and having this plan for a model that is focusing on addressing the stated needs of affected communities, not donors' perceived needs, of course, and it would be make sure we're inclusive of local actors and the engagement with proximal resources. I know there's a lot of talk about domestic resource mobilization, et cetera, all things that we would be wanting to have happen in suite, in concert with each other. Even things like pooled funds that have been the most responsive to community assessed needs have been very useful as a source, but it's voluntary funding from small groups of international government donors, and thus a risk like this rupture today also undermines those, because a big donor or two who pull back in a moment in time, it's very problematic. I know I'm still talking about the problem versus the solutions. I think we have to be doing both. The trick now, or the challenge, is we are 7 or 8 weeks into a very intentionally chaotic mess. And, we are trying to reinvent what we do next to protect livelihoods today, without sacrificing tomorrow. But the tomorrow is the thing that gets sacrificed when these terrible choices are thrust upon a community and a sector that is trying to do responsible, independent, impartial humanitarian action, all the good things that we strive for. But we do need to be engaging private sector in humanitarian and development finance. We know there's a bit of a myth that there is no money. There is how money flows. Public-private collaborations need to be expedited, while also not losing the integrity and the principles around accountability and transparency and models that are also fundamental. And now is the time. We have to be. The forcing function is beyond now to reimagine humanitarian aid and develop these more resilient and independent funding mechanisms so that life-saving programs can continue regardless of these political swings that we're experiencing and that have been discussed. I know this sector that I've spent my career, and I think all of us have worked in, will not be the same, and we have to be adaptive and find new ways. But we also have to get out of this extreme chaos, see through the din, because we are working on protecting lives now while also reimagining something. So it's a time for everybody to come together to think about our common humanity, to have local voices at the table, to figure out ways forward that do less harm as possible right now in this harm-created scenario triggered by the United States government.
Thanks, Abby. Let me just pick up on that, many of the things you've said, but let me just zero in on the sector will never be the same, or the prediction of, and therefore new ideas again on the financing side. Or Jeremy or Matthew, do you have sort of examples of innovative or exciting or new potential sources of funding that you think are showing promise?
So I worked at the Center for Global Development for 4 years between the Obama and Biden administrations, and did a lot of work on rethinking humanitarian financial models. And I think the financing model, the kind of financial architecture of the humanitarian system has had huge problems with it. It allocates too much to large the large global organizations. It subdivides way too much of the funding according to the mandate of those organizations rather than being more proximal, as Abby talked about. So I have a million ideas on how to rewire the financial system of the financial model of the humanitarian system, and all of those get much, much harder as a result of what's happening now. I don't think, I don't want anyone to think that there's somehow, so much inefficiency in the humanitarian system that you could lose 40%, rewire it, and still hit a lot of the same marks. You just can't. You simply can't. And I don't see that money coming from anywhere else. The kind of the role of the private sector has been this sort of windmill that we've been tilting at in humanitarianism for as long as I've been in it. We have yet to see the private sector ever really engage in the humanitarian system in a serious way. There are some. I think MasterCard has been great on providing services for the cash because they have a business interest in doing that, and that's been great. There are a few examples like that, but as a funder, no. As a source of resources, no. Humanitarian work is not profitable. It's not something that you can make it's not a profitable business. It tends to be in high risk environments that the private sector doesn't want to go. And the way that the private sector tends to engage is very reactive and episodic. So when I was at USAID, we had NGO partners and UN partners that we talked to all the time, and we had an ongoing relationship with and knew what they needed to do in a crisis. And then the private sector would briefly be interested after something hit the headlines, and then that interest would dissipate again as soon as it was out of the headlines. And so we would be fielding calls from the Googles of the world after the crisis was in the headlines saying, "Hey, what do you need us to do?" And it's like, now is not the time to have that conversation. We can't help you understand this system when we are in the heat of crisis response. When we then would try to engage after, then the interest wasn't there because the motivation was gone once it was out of the headlines. So I would love to see that change. I don't think structurally the private sector is set up to do this. I'm a little more hopeful about development finance. I do think that there are things that the humanitarian response system does that could be shifted in some ways to development finance models. Something like long-term refugee care and maintenance. I think that could be funded in some interesting ways by development finance investments or kind of concessional lending to refugee hosting countries and things like that. I think there's some real promise there. Of course, we'll see what happens with the bank's concessional lending too. That might be the next target of the administration. So, I think there is some innovation possible on the bank side. There's a lot of innovation possible in terms of optimizing the financial model of the humanitarian system. None of that is going to be possible for the next few years because organizations are simply going into survival mode and defensive mode. And it's going to be very, very hard to have any kind of serious conversation about reforming the financial architecture of the humanitarian system when organizations are dying left and right and just triaging, and kind of deciding, do we let people die here or do we let people die there? Like that is not the time to have what is really a complex and thoughtful conversation about reform.
Yeah.
I really appreciate that, Abby and Jeremy. Sorry, Matthew, you're going to jump right in. Go for it. Over to you.
I was just shifting a little bit. I think I agree with everything that's been said. And I think the other piece to put on the table is the perspective from low and middle income countries. Because I think Abby's point is exactly right. This idea that there is no money, that there's not enough money, is a fiction, right? It's a fiction that's being created in this moment of crisis by folks that are saying, well, we can't afford to. But actually, all of the evidence says that there is plenty of money out there, right? I mean, the stock market tells us there's plenty of money out there. So, at risk of being too Pollyannish, our problem is not a lack of global resources, right? And so one other piece to look at, I think, is where do countries themselves find money to pay for these things, and why don't we have the fiscal space for this to happen? How are we in a situation where the withdrawal of one country and one donor is so massively, massively disruptive? And in that sense, I think one thing that's critical to look at is this question around debt and where money is actually flowing. Because if you look right now, you've got, just looking at the African continent, you've got 34 countries that are spending more servicing their debt than they are on all of health and education spending together. If you look, I had the number here, it's $82 billion was African servicing on debt. Aid, as a comparison, was $36 billion, right? And so the kind of the idea that what we're doing here is we somehow have a lack of money is wrong. And then what that tells us, I think, is that there's kind of two kind of moments right now that we need to see. Is one is in this moment, we do not have the ability or the luxury to try not to talk about these questions at this moment, because what we should expect is this massive disruption to the sector. And one of the best things you could possibly do is to move in the next 12 months to cancel as much debt as we possibly can, because we know that that will enable many countries to step in. It will not solve the humanitarian crisis by any stretch of the imagination. Let me be very clear. This is not emergency money. This is about kind of medium term. How do you actually kind of address some of these pieces? And then second, I would say really moving away from this idea of charity, right? That was kind of mentioned earlier, right? What we are talking about on this call is not a matter of charity, right? It's actually a matter of global stability. It's a matter of global well-being. It's about American kind of well-being as much as it is European well-being, as much as it is African, Asian, and Latin American. And so that means that kind of one thing we've got to move toward is understanding assessed contributions in a different way and understanding kind of global public goods in a different way. And I think anybody in the sector that's thinking about financing is not thinking about kind of right now, at least the folks that I'm talking to are not thinking about kind of will the private sector pay more. They're thinking about how do we actually kind of build a new infrastructure for public investment that isn't so vulnerable to even the idea of charity. And I think this is where sometimes the sector really does play on this idea of like kindness and giving and all of these things. But when we're talking about kind of, refugee crises, we're talking about pandemics, we're talking about these things, these are, things that are deeply kind of about global stability. And so there shouldn't be a question of like, well, would I like to pay this money in? And so there, it's worth thinking about kind of a global public goods approach that actually requires that these emergency services, these interventions are required of the world. And I'm looking in part to the G20 and thinking that there might be opportunities to see some shifts there in the short term, but that will not relieve the short-term crisis.
All right, thanks. I'm going to get a little more chaotic now, so I just encourage each of the panelists to jump in, and there will be a little bit of who goes first, but I think it's maybe recognizing the time. We have a number of questions and comments coming in from, so as I earlier had set up, and thanks for all those comments on the financing and potential changes, are really very valuable points made. If we can shift now to potential changes on how the sector is managed or how the ecosystem is managed, and the three questions that relate to that have been posed to this now, how are we managing differently in response? One is on the global coordination side. Will this have an impact on overall globally who will lead, and recognizing, of course, as has been mentioned, how heavy proportionally USAID was, American government was, but now as they exit the sector in some way, this whole ecosystem in some ways, do you see an impact on how it overall globally is going to be governed, the humanitarian sector? Secondly, how it's coordinated at country level and how it's prioritized in country level. Is there going to be an impact on a change in the way that works and managed, and how assistance is prioritized? And then there's a specific question on, do you see a change on the public-private relationship? I know you've made already a couple, Jeremy, for sure, you mentioned about the limitations of the private sector, but do you see these changes having an impact on the way the private sector and the partnerships with the public sector will be operational in this sector? So who would like to just jump in, or please, let me just pass the open up. Yeah, Abby, you want to go for it?
Jeremy and Matthew will be able to add and say more, but well, a few things. One, I did want to pick up on one very last thing from before about, the notion that this is about money and myth, the fiction. Thank you, Matthew. I think we are very aligned there. Because it is a question of political will, and what we're seeing right now is rapacious greed and and the world's richest man heading this so-called Doge, working with this new administration to ensure tax cuts for the wealthy. So this is a case in point. I don't mean to sound hyperbolic, of stealing from the poor to give to the rich. There is something that cannot be lost in this conversation as we try to care about common humanity and global security and global cooperation and coordination, all the things that we as a community have worked hard and learned of how to have better practice over time on issues that affect us all. So I just couldn't help myself and throwing that pitch in. But in terms of global coordination and governance, as we know, the U.S. government has been a leader in terms of best practice and research and knowledge and practice that has actually driven often much of the great practice addressing chronic food insecurity for the most vulnerable in East Africa. I mean, the list goes on. I could name them all. And so now there is, I would say, a gap in a very chaotic time of global coordination and leadership. The UN, as we've already mentioned, that had been tasked through the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance as one example, the cluster system, all of these things that have proliferated with intention. Definite reform was always needed. No one was against making it better and more efficient, but this way of bringing a wrecking ball to it means that we're still in the fray of just trying to, and as Jeremy and Matthew already said, save lives and keep the work going. So there will need to be a new global coordination. I think right now it is in utter disarray. Because of this, the UN has to move a little more quickly too. The financial impact on them shouldn't be overstated, and I don't think we're seeing the speed with which we would hope movement there. Country level, absolutely. I think that's going to be where some of the action needs to be in the absence of global leadership, and the public-private relationships. Maybe I'll pass the floor because there's so much to say, and I might hog the space. But there's a lot there in those important questions, and I think we need to be inventing it, improving it, while we're also trying to survive and make sure the most marginalized who deserve this the absolute least are not completely and utterly abandoned, which is really what the approach has forced the community into this survival mode.
Thanks, Abby. Matthew or Jeremy, the potential of global pivoting on coordination, planning, prioritization at national level, private-public partnerships, national level, thoughts?
I mean, I think one thing that's just worth framing here is that most of what we're actually talking about here isn't optional, right?
Hang on just a second. Matthew, I think you're speaking, but you're on mute. I think we'll continue with.
Nope, we're hearing him. I can hear you, Matt.
I think it might be on your end, Rob.
Go for it. Yeah.
No problem. I think what I was just gonna say, I think most of what we're talking about is it's not optional, right? And so, if we were in a world where what was being debated was, well, shall this interesting grant program continue because it's an interesting idea that might have long-term benefits, that would be a different conversation. But actually, countries, including the United States, are going to face the effects of refugee crises, are going to face the effects of pandemics, are going to face the effects of humanitarian crises, whether or not we want to imagine it will be true or not. And so in that sense, what we're actually looking at kind of going forward is, as Abby was saying, kind of a sector that will be different, and that is certainly true. It is a sector that will continue, however, right? And so in that sense, what we're actually going to see is far less effective coordination, far less effective use of funding, and a ton more kind of, moving back to kind of communities that are actually going to be facing the coal face of this and having to respond. In that sense, one of the principles is that the work that's been done over kind of the last decade to ensure that there are kind of global warning systems and global efforts, a lot of that is being kind of interrupted, but it needs to be kind of supported and put back, and pieces of it will be, right? In the medium term, the bottom line is, if this is sustained, we're looking at a decade of just massive crisis. And we are, there's no way around that. That's just what's going to happen. We should not underestimate the point that was made earlier, which is that also this is illegal, right? The Congress has actually appropriated this money. And so it is not at all clear to me that the United States is out of foreign aid or is out of humanitarian assistance. Marco Rubio can tweet about how he has canceled 83% of the grants. Well, that 83% of the money, it's actually been appropriated by Congress, and that is law. We'll see what that's going to come in the courts is going to be very substantial. And then around the world, what we're going to see is these systems starting to crumble, but hopefully some resilience there as it goes. And this fundamental role of the United Nations is actually going to become, in my opinion, more central, even as they have less resources than it has been in other settings, because there are kind of often the United States has played an outsized role, sometimes for good and sometimes for ill, in kind of global coordination in that way. And there isn't another actor that's going to be able to step into that space in that full way. And so the UN is actually going to end up in a place with less resources, but more coordination requirements. And I hope that it will be able to bear that brunt, but I think that that's what we see coming.
I think, and I'll pass to you, Jeremy, in a second, but Matthew, just that final coming from the UN system for the last 3 decades, the challenge, as was earlier mentioned, is the UN's in a state of crisis now too. And so to step up at this stage is, although I do completely agree with you, there is a necessity, it's just whether there's going to be the capacity, recognizing the crisis, and many organizations and entities of the UN are in it also at the moment. Can I pass to you, Jeremy, for additional thoughts on impact on the ways of working globally and or at country level, private, public, private, but also maybe just building on Matthew, your important point on refugees and displacement, Jeremy, recognizing the organization you're coming from, maybe you want to zero in a little bit on specifically also the incredibly profound scale of the challenge we're currently facing globally on displacement.
Yeah, well, a few things. I think systems that are going to break down and coordination structures that are going to break down, I think early warning is going to take a huge hit. I don't know if it's well understood how much of global early warning, not just on famine, but also on natural hazard crises, really comes from the US government. So, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that does, predicts hurricanes in the US, they monitor those events all over the world. And so, the early warning that we would do for, say, events in the Pacific, OFDA, my old office, now BHA, would issue those based on NOAA data. Volcanic and seismic risk, you can't predict an earthquake, but you can predict a volcano. Well, we had a program called the Volcano Disaster Assistance Project that had gotten very, very good at ensuring that countries with seismic risk could avoid deaths from volcanic eruption. That's going to go. FuseNet, obviously, we've talked about, that's going to go. So we're going to see more preventable deaths from predictable but unpredicted disasters than needs to be the case. Other countries could potentially take the mantle on that, and maybe over time they will, but in the immediate, for the next few years, that's just going to go away unless it is preserved from the US side. On the refugee and displacement piece, we have the highest numbers of displaced people, forcibly displaced people in the world now since the Second World War. It is absolutely a manageable number of people if we choose to manage it. The proportion of people displaced now in the world is still lower than it was in the immediate aftermath of World War II as a share of population. It's a manageable problem. What we're going to see is what happens when we fully stop trying to manage it. If you pull most of the aid, say half of humanitarian aid out of refugee camps and half of humanitarian aid out of internal displacement crises. You're going to see a lot more IDPs becoming refugees. You're going to see a lot more refugees becoming migrants. So, for an administration that really hates migration, they are going to, this is going to be a fascinating experiment on what happens on the global migration front when you stop supporting refugees close to the countries they're from. The first Trump administration understood that, and they actually ramped up support to UNHCR and the International Organization for Migration for exactly that reason. They didn't want refugees coming here, but they understood that then the flip side of that is more needs to be done to support them in countries of first asylum. Now they're going to do both, and it's a real question mark what's going to happen. I think it's going to be very ugly and very hard on displaced people. And there is just a level of callous disregard for human life that underpins everything we're seeing on this front from this administration. And to kind of pull that back again to the domestic front, it's very concerning that if they are willing to let, as Matt said, millions of people die from HIV over the next few years, if they are willing to let hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people starve by pulling back U.S. humanitarian assistance, that level of callous disregard for human life is not likely to stay only overseas for the entirety of the next 4 years.
Okay, I'm going to do my best that we don't sort of cut conversations off right at that, but we're going to stick to the 1 hour to be fair to all of you and to our participants. So we have about 7 or 8 minutes left. Or 6 minutes left. What I would suggest is there's a few questions on what can we do? What can the students do? Some of the participants here, I'm sure, will be students. Some are interested party. I'll just pass around to see if you have suggestions on, now that they've been motivated by this conversation, what would you recommend for people to get involved, and for people to engage in this conversation or to influence, etc. And then I'll just do one more final round of any final takeaway messages. And I think that's what we'll do for the last few minutes we have together. So I don't want to insist on an order, but does anybody want to jump in on recommendations or suggestions for people to get involved?
I'm happy to kick off. I think one of the most important things that people can be doing right now is making sure your members of Congress are hearing from you on the importance of this. Members of Congress are not used to hearing about USAID. They're not used to hearing particularly good things, positive things from their constituents about USAID. So weighing in with your member of Congress, particularly, if you're back in district at any point, weighing in with them there, make your voice heard. If you have a Republican member of Congress or senator, particularly valuable. Lisa Murkowski the other day tweeted that she had met with some Alaskans who were members of who had been employees of USAID, and was pretty appalled by what she heard about how they'd been tweeted. So, more things like that are very, very helpful. And likewise, pushing back on social media, where a lot of this is happening right now is over Twitter. I had kind of dialed back my Twitter presence, and I've dialed it back up again, because that is where, that is the mainstream of disinformation that's happening about USAID's role and USAID's programs and about foreign aid in general. So, it is important to be on there doing some battle. One thing that I've noticed is often when I do a thread defending USAID or defending foreign aid, I'll get a bunch of Elon stans in my mentions pushing back. And that, I see that as a positive thing, because that means they are beginning to see it. And I think it is important to puncture through the kind of closed epistemic ecosystem that a lot of them live within, and get some counterfactuals in front of them.
Matthew, Abby, thanks. Jeremy, anything to add?
I'll come in. Jeremy, Matthew, would you like to? It's not getting defeated or dispirited. It really is time to mobilize. And, the goal is to exhaust and dispirit, I think. Again, keep calling members of Congress, everything Jeremy said, plus. And right now, this week, We're seeing some of the meta membership groups come together, the U.S. Global Leadership Council, along with Interaction, and all of us who are doing the work. And there's a week of action for U.S. international assistance happening this week. There's lobby days and other actions going on. You can go to websites to see how, there's some more prescribed ways to send letters to your members of Congress and other actions that you can be taking. So make sure you stay involved, whether it's social media, flooding the members of Congress who are starting, as Jeremy said, to hear and recognize the far-reaching implications that harm, Americans, everyday people everywhere. What happens elsewhere happens to others. And stay involved, support the causes you care about deeply, and to keep on. We have to keep on fighting for what we believe and against some of these very dark processes and efforts that are happening to really hurt our common humanity. So not getting dispirited, come up with ideas, mobilize, do what you feel safe and comfortable doing, but there's lots of ways to stay engaged.
Thanks, Abby. Matthew, any final?
I'll put on my political scientist hat for just a second and say, one of the things that is true is that every administration looks very strong in its first 3 months. And every administration makes moves. These are remarkable moves. They are outside of the norm by every measure in many ways. That said, we're not done. And one of the narratives that I think is most dangerous right now that I've seen in the media, I've seen on social media, and I've seen in Congress is, oh, well, it's too bad that they. And they have not done this yet, right? This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of an attempt. It's a bold attempt, but Secretary Rubio does not have the power to not spend this money under the United States Constitution. The US Congress is still a major player in these questions. And so far, what they have said is that they still want us to be involved as the United States of America in supporting foreign aid and supporting humanitarian responses and fighting pandemics. And so if that is true, then what we have right now is a moment of contention. Not a moment of loss, but a moment of contention. And in that moment of contention, the core question is all of the things that you heard Jeremy and Abby say that I won't repeat, but that just matter right now. And remembering that there are multipolar, it's a multipolar world, and that out there are many countries that have power, but we also have a multipolar country in the United States, and that is still playing out. And so the most important thing is not to accept, well, they had this power, they seized this power, and they did this terrible thing, but instead to say that can't stand, and assume that actually it won't. And push to make sure that it doesn't.
Great. So I think with just a final sentence or two, maybe we'll go Jeremy, then back to you, Matthew, just to give you a break. And then Abby, I'll give you the final word. Jeremy, Matthew, Abby, Jeremy.
Sure. Yeah, I want to foot stomp again and echo what Matt just said. None of this is legal. And it is really, really important not to accept the unlawful destruction of an agency, not to accept the unlawful and what is functionally the impoundment of federally appropriated funds. And so, as we go forward, the court cases and congressional action are going to be really important here. We are accustomed to administrations, if they don't like the way, if they want to change something, starting from the law and then determining what does the law allow us to do, and we go from there. That is not what this administration does. The approach of this administration is to violate the law and dare the courts or dare the Congress to enforce it and to limit them. And you can see that in everything that they've done. You can see that even in their response to the lawsuits that have challenged them, where even when federal judges have told them to comply with the law, have given them very strict instructions on what to do, they defy and defy and defy and defy. So, there will need to be there are going to be a lot of lawsuits. Now, we're lucky that they are being so clumsy with the law because it makes the lawsuits easier to win. They have not done well in court so far, and that's what tends to happen when you violate the law with as much abandon as they do. But ultimately, we're not going to win this in the courts. It has to be a combination of courts and congressional action, and just driving as much of a wedge as we can between particularly Congress and some of the the Doge folks and Pete Morocco and some of the folks who are just most obscenely disregarding the law. That will be a really, really important piece of all of this. And the stakes of failure here really are millions and millions of lives.
Thank you, Jeremy. Matthew, a sentence too?
We are in an era of rising pandemics, right? We're in a world in which the coal-face situation of people and humans and animals and globalization is resulting in pandemics. There has not been a president or a prime minister in a generation that's left without facing a pandemic, and that is not going to shift. And so I guess I would just say that for all of the students and the young people that might be on here and others, that one kind of interpretation that's out there is that like we've kind of like moved away from doing global health or doing global humanitarianism. We can't, we won't, right? And in fact, if you look back at history, you've seen not quite this level of assault on this kind of a sector, but certainly moments of kind of isolationism and moves, and then they're followed by counter moves. And so I think our work here is to build that counter movement, ensure that it is as fast as possible, not exit the sector, not assume that we are moving into isolationism, but understand this to be a moment of transition and push as hard as we can to ensure that that transition has as limited impact of the most vulnerable people around the world as we possibly can, but also to ensure that we don't exit and instead we start to build toward what's going to come next.
Thanks, Matthew. Abby, final word?
Well, there's lots of spaces to watch. Stay involved every day. Just today, the government has been ordered to pay some of what it is owed at close of business today of the $2 billion of work completed. We, as Oxfam, have a lawsuit. There's multiple of us throwing sand in the gears to the extent we can, but those can take a long time. But staying active, staying involved, don't listen to this gaslighting that thoughtful reviews have been undertaken. There is nothing responsible, thoughtful about any of this. It has been, social media, people are being fed, things that are utterly untrue. Stay involved, stay informed, connect with families and friends, colleagues, students, peers. Staying involved is one of the most important things we can all do and not get dispirited. We have to fight and we have to play both. I hate to use the metaphor, long game, short game, but people's lives are at stake today. And also everybody is interconnected. It is a local and global effort. And those of us here in the United States have a lot we must and can do to fight the good fights.
Thank you very, very much, Abby. Thanks to all three panelists. Incredibly impressive, very articulate, very worrying overall, but I greatly appreciate your time and energy that you've put into this conversation. Thank you all to the participants for joining us. Please do complete the survey to share your perspective. And the next session will be on March 20th, and we'll further explore the themes in this conversation. Thanks to everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.